Good evening. My name is Peter Christian. I am the director of the Gotham Center for New York City History, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our conversation tonight. For those of you not familiar with the Gotham Center, as usual, we invite you to learn more about us online at gothamcenter.org, where you can find well over 1,000 essays, book reviews, event recordings, podcasts, digital exhibits, and more on all things New York City history. Tonight, as part of our regular series featuring some of the best and most interesting new research on New York City history, we'll be discussing this disturbing and excellent new book from Stacy Horn, The Killing Fields of East New York. In the early 1990s, murder rates in this Brooklyn neighborhood climbed to the highest in New York City history. And in Horn's groundbreaking work of investigative journalism, the author argues that the roots of this crisis began with the subprime mortgage scandal of the 1970s. In response to redlining and other housing discrimination practices, Lyndon B. Johnson had pushed the Housing and Urban Development Act through Congress, ostensibly meant to help low-income families of color join the post-war boom in white home ownership. But over the next generation, banks, lenders, realtors, and corrupt FHA officials engaged in what she calls a white-collar crime spree, reducing a once prospering neighborhood to abandoned buildings and empty lots, which ended in a massive wave of homicides and the largest series of mortgage fraud prosecutions in U.S. histories. I'm going to leave the detective story there for our speaker, but allow me first to introduce her briefly. Stacy Horn is an independent writer and the author of 7 books, including The Restless Sleep, a behind-the-scenes look into the careers of NYPD detectives charged with solving cold cases, and how those often exhaustive pursuits interact with new technology and department politics. Her last book, Damnation Island, Poor, Sick, Mad, and Criminal in 19th Century New York, spotlighted the history of Roosevelt Island, or Blackwells, and was featured in the Gotham Center's podcast series, Sights and Sounds. I'm delighted to be welcoming her here to her first time in our interview series. Stacy is going to kick things off with an overview of the book, and then we'll have conversation followed by Q&A from you. As usual, we have disabled the chat and hand-raising functions in Zoom out of respect to our guests. So if you have a question, as always, I invite you to use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen at any time during the next hour. We will address those questions at 7:30 or so. So with that, please join me in welcoming our guests with the usual silent applause.
Okay. I'm going to give a slightly longer version of what Peter already went over. One second. Sorry. Okay. This started in the wrong place. There's where I want to start. Okay, I just wanted to briefly talk about how I came to write this book. And it goes back to The Restless Sleep, which Peter already mentioned, which I wrote 20 years ago. And in the process of researching that book, I learned that East New York, which is in Brooklyn, has the highest number of unsolved homicides in New York City, and I never forgot that. At the same time, when that book came out, there was a big white-collar case being tried, and it was in all the papers, and I had just come off all this research where I was able to learn tons about murder in the United States and unsolved murder in the United States. There's just so much data out there. I would be able to tell you how many people got murdered in every town, city, state in the United States. So white-collar crime was in all the papers, so I was wondering, well, how bad is white-collar crime? How extensive is it? Are there tons of white-collar criminals out there? And so I called every organization that I thought could answer that question. So I called the DOJ, the SEC, the FBI, attorneys general, And absolutely everyone down the line, when I asked them how many white collar crimes are committed in the United States each year, how many are investigated, how many are prosecuted, how many people are put in jail, everyone said, we don't know. I mean, even for the cases that they were investigating, they couldn't tell me. And by this point, I was writing an op-ed for the New York Times. So they're basically telling the New York Times, we can't tell you anything about white collar crime, we don't know. So I thought this was a big thing. It was important that we don't know. I mean, white collar could be enormous and devastating. We just don't know. We have no picture of white collar crime in the United States. So when I wrote the op-ed, I thought there'd be a reaction, and there was nothing. It was just crickets. And I shouldn't have been surprised. Whenever I talked to anybody about this, nobody seemed to care. Crickets. So for 20 years, I've had my eye out for a story that I could tell that would illustrate why it was important that we know about the extent of white-collar crime in the United States. And I had an editor ask me if I would be willing to write a true crime book, and I'm not a true crime writer, and I wasn't really interested, but as soon as she said that, I flashed back on that fact that East New York has the highest number of unsolved homicides. So I thought, before I say no, let me look into that. Maybe there's a story there. And there was, and that led to this book. So my book, I traced all these murders back to white-collar financial crimes in the 1960s and the 1970s, which, by the way, were happening nationwide, but I use East New York as my example in the book. So my book has two threads. One tracks the white-collar crimes, the discovery and investigation, the trial, and the result of that, and the decline in East New York. And they're very short chapters, just constantly going back and forth, showing how what was happening in East New York was tied to these crimes. So when I began my research, I had this idea that East New York was always bad. And I learned right away that no, it was actually a very nice neighborhood that started in 1837 and just was, evolved and got better and better. And I found these two books that were written in the 1940s, and I just want to read one quote. The book on the left was written by the son of German immigrants, and he described how East New York grew from a small, and I'm quoting him, a small cluster of farms to a community of modern homes, churches, and schools, which still preserve the best elements of suburban character. So 1940s, East New York, still good. And I put this picture up because this is an accurate picture of the demographic of East New York at the time. Up until the 1950s, East New York was 98% white, and it was made up mostly of Jewish, Italian, and German immigrants, but still nice and up and coming. Projects were built to house middle class and lower income families. So here is East New York in the 1950s when the demographics began to change, but it was still nice. These projects that I mentioned, I talked to people who grew up in them, and they described them as sanctuaries. I have this one quote from Jan Goldberg. He came to East New York in 1957 from Brownsville, another neighborhood in Brooklyn, with not a great reputation. And he called it a step up. Going to East New York was a step up. And he said it was like we moved to heaven. Then, in the 1960s, everything changed. And it happened so quickly that the people that I talked to said it was like it happened overnight. And one guy told me by 1970, you couldn't walk down the street. And by 1970, the families of all the people that I had interviewed who'd grown up there were gone. So what happened? First, two crime waves moved through East New York, and Peter already mentioned them: blockbusting and redlining. And I'm assuming most people here know what it is, but just in case, very quickly, blockbusting was the process where real estate brokers and mortgage banks just would, invade a neighborhood, harassing and bullying the people who lived there into selling their homes, telling them that as the neighborhood became more integrated, crime would go up, their property values would go down. And as the neighborhoods did become more integrated, banks would draw red lines around the neighborhood, denying financial services to anybody within. So in response to the integration that had begun to happen in East New York, a lot of people were just fine with it, but racist gangs like SPONGE, which stands for the Society for the Prevention of Negroes Getting Everything, and that was what how they described that acronym when they were talking to the papers, but among themselves, they used a different N-word. So these racist gangs emerged, and Lindsay, in the summer of 1966, came to East New York to talk to local leaders about civil unrest. And the Sponge guys came to protest Lindsay, and he was there at this restaurant, and they were outside holding signs that said things like 2468, we don't want to integrate. And the police came and they kept order, and Lindsay was able to leave without incident. But these guys didn't show up just to protest. They wanted to start trouble. So after Lindsay left, more and more of them arrived. And at the same time, a group of young black men and children came down one street towards the restaurant. They wanted to see Lindsay, and they weren't aware that he had left. The Sponge guys attacked, and an 11-year-old boy was killed. This led to riots, and riots is not an accurate word to describe what happened and what was happening in the United States at the time, but I'm going to use the words in my talk because that was the word that was used at the time. So when Dean was killed, a riot broke out. And at the time, in the 60s, there were civil rights riots all across the country. The next year, there were 150 of them, which led to 83 deaths, millions of dollars worth of damage. In response, Johnson put together this group that came to be known as the Kerner Commission, and he charged them to research and find out what was happening, why were people rioting, and what could we do about it. And they made a real honest effort to answer those questions. They went out and around the country, talked to people, and actually listened. And the report is pretty amazing, especially considering the time. And in answer to why this was happening, they came back with a devastatingly simple answer, and they said, it's happening because America is a racist country. And I have a quote. Segregation and poverty have created in the racial ghetto a destructive environment totally unknown to most white Americans. White institutions created it, white institutions maintain it, and white society condones it. And they gave him a list of problems. The most serious problems, in a long list of them, were the police, unemployment due to racial discrimination, and housing discrimination. Racism in America was so bad and so systemic that only, and now I'm quoting them again, a compassionate, massive, and sustained effort could even begin to address it. And I think they chose those words very carefully. Compassionate had to be real, and at least some sincerity, some desire to want to fix the problem. It had to be massive, which really translates to a lot of money. And it has to be sustained. You can't just start a few programs and move on and think the problem's solved. So this led to two acts, the Civil Rights Act, which made housing discrimination illegal, and the Housing and Urban Development Act, which created programs that would make it easier for families of color, low-income families and middle-income families of color, to buy homes. And I think that he focused on housing because of all the problems that they listed. This this was one where they had even a chance of addressing. This was something that if you threw a lot of money at it, it's not going to fix the problem, but again, it would move the needle. Whereas the police, this was at a time when most people would not even recognize or acknowledge that the police were even a problem. So, and I do want to point out that the FHA already had programs since the 1930s to help middle and lower income families to buy homes, but historically, families of color had been prevented from using these programs. But now, HUD, which was a new department, and the FHA was folded into HUD, now they were required to affirmatively further fair housing, which led to the third crime wave, and this is what my book is about. We all know about the 2008 subprime mortgage scandal. Well, the first one happened in the late 60s and the 1970s. And essentially, the U.S. government was doing everything in its power to encourage lending to people of color and low-income families, and in the process, they created the subprime mortgage business. Loans that were previously deemed risky, that is, not prime, became a hot commodity. And financial criminals took one look at these programs and saw a way of getting rich, which led to thousands of foreclosures in neighborhoods of color across the United States, which led to abandoned buildings, which led to a rise in crime, and completely destabilized neighborhoods of color across the country. And I just want to do another quote, because some people go, how could abandoned buildings do this? And there was an article in the May 1972 issue of HUD's magazine Challenge, where they were at the time being sued for these abandoned buildings, but they were still agreeing that they were bad. And from this article in that issue, the theme of which, vacant buildings are bad, they said, the degenerative effects on peripheral buildings and blocks cannot be exaggerated. The abandoned building is not merely a symbol of the decline, but an active factor. And by the end of the 1960s, there were 1,000 abandoned buildings in East New York, and soon 2,500, and 1/5 of East New York was abandoned land. This is just another picture showing the abandoned land. And these two pictures are from 1972. So the crime became known as the FHA scandal, and I'll just briefly say what it was. And it's pretty much the same crime as the 2008 subprime mortgage scandal, but that became more sophisticated, and well, that's another story. Anyway, because of block busting and redlining, the neighborhood had started to decline. People couldn't get loans to make repairs when their buildings needed it, and brokers and buildings took advantage of that. So they could buy a lot of buildings cheap, which is what they did. And normally, before the FHA will insure a mortgage, the next step would be an appraiser comes in, makes a list of what needs to be repaired and replaced, and then makes a provisionary appraisal of what the building is worth. But white-collar criminals had bribed the FHA and appraisers and underwriters to say that the work was done and that the home was worth the same as a nice home in the suburbs. So they'd buy a building for, say, $5,000, spend $100 in paint to make it presentable, and then sell it for 3 times as much or more. It doesn't sound like a lot, but they made millions. People who came to rent, they would say, why rent, a building from, a slumlord who never fixes anything when you can buy a nice home for as little as $200 down and have this nice home yourself. So if the people expressed any kind of misgivings about the buildings, they would say the government came in and they said this is a safe and sound building and it's up to code. But homeowners were moving into buildings with faulty wiring, broken and non-existing furnaces, water tanks that had to be replaced, rats, ceilings that would fall in shortly. Foreclosure was inevitable. So in case anybody does decide to read my book, I wanted to just put a few faces to some of the people I write about. This is one of the brokers that was in on it. And a friend of mine who read my book said to me when she was finished, it takes a village, using that line, it takes a village to raise a child. And she was referring to the fact that it takes a village to commit this crime, and because so many people were in on it. This is the Assistant United States Attorney who prosecuted the case. When it first came to the Eastern District, it was given to one AUSA who it sat there for months because mortgage crimes are just not sexy. But Aceta had grown up in a neighborhood with a lot of immigrants, Puerto Rican immigrants to be exact, and he was just, he couldn't stand the idea of how these hardworking immigrants who could have been his neighbors how they were being duped and losing everything ultimately. So he took to it as like a mission, and it became the largest and longest trial in the history of the Eastern District at the time. This is the FBI agent who oversaw the case that I feature in the book, the Eastern Service Corporation, which was one of the largest mortgage banks on the East Coast. And his questioning of a suspect led to the first major break in the case. Jeffrey Kay, he had another bank. George Romney, Mitt's dad, he was the head of HUD at the time, and he was actually a strong supporter of civil rights, and furthering fair housing was a mission that he took on, with everything he had, and he believed in it and he wanted to fulfill it. This is Judge Anthony Chapia, who oversaw the case, dancing with Shirley Chisholm. She makes an appearance in the book because she was one of the few people talking about what was happening with candor. So as East New York went in decline and murders went up, it started collecting these morbid nicknames. There was one building in these housing projects, I believe these are Unity, became known, the housing police called it the slaughterhouse because of the number of people that were murdered there. This is an alley that goes through the Unity projects where so many people were murdered, it became known as Death Alley. And this is the intersection between different housing projects, which became known as the Four Corners of Death. So as East New York went in decline, New York City's response was essentially to go into retreat. They closed schools, they closed hospitals. There was less money for everything, education, sanitation. And I do want to point out that New York City was in a financial crisis at the time. So they were making cuts everywhere, but they were making the most cuts in neighborhoods like East New York, who could afford it the least. This is a hospital that closed. So these abandoned buildings became places for crimes. Murders would happen there, rapes would happen there. I have this quote from a commanding officer who worked in the 7-5, that was the precinct that oversees New York. He worked at the time, and he said women going to or returning from shopping or work would be dragged into these buildings by predators who knew the location provided the perfect physical cover and concealment. And there was this one horrible period where they were dragging women into these buildings up to the roof. They would rape them and then throw them off the roof when they were done. So the total murders from 1980 to 2024 were 2,001. And The number of unsolved was 688. Roughly 35% of all murders in New York City go unsolved. You know, one year they might do better, one year they might do worse, but it's usually around 35. And they're actually pretty good compared to the nationwide statistic, which I believe is at 45% right now. So the 7-5 at the time had this joke: give us 22 minutes, we'll give you a homicide. And if you grew up in East New York, you know exactly where they got that. But for those who didn't, there was a news radio station that had this catchphrase: give us 22 minutes, we'll give you the world. So a friend of mine made this large map for me of East New York. And what I did was I started making dots for every murder. And I don't know if you can tell, but the red dots are for every murder that is unsolved. So you can see there's a lot of murders. Now, this is a small section of East New York, and it is where it was worse. But I want to point out that the murders that you're seeing here are only 7 years worth. I did this because I wanted to add the dots as the murders happened so I could see where they were happening and when, so I could see essentially the murders bloom. So if I had put all the dots for all the murders come up to today, this map would be plastered. I picked one unsolved murder case to feature the book, to anchor the East New York chapters. And I picked this young woman because she was born in East New York in 1974 when it really started to go bad. And she was murdered in East New York in 1992 when East New York essentially blew up. And as crime was going up in East New York, it was also going up in the 7-5 precinct. And I tell a number of stories to illustrate what was going on in the precinct. But this is a picture of Michael Dowd, who was assigned to the 7-5 in 1983, and he and his partner partnered with and other police officers in the 7-5 partnered with drug dealers in East New York, and they supplied the drug dealers with guns, police radios, information about when there was going to be a raid, and in exchange for this, they were each paid $8,000 a week, I believe it was, and it came to $208,000 a year each. So as New York City and the United States, stepped back from what was going on in these neighborhoods across the country, the community stepped up to the plate. And this is just a partial list of the organizations that I learned about, both local and national, that came to East New York and tried to do something about it. And I told a few stories featuring some of these groups. But I think I'll stop there, and we can go to the talk part. Stop share.
Let's go to the talk part.
The talk part, sorry. Is the
No,
sharing off? Do you have the regular
sharing is off. The
Okay.
sharing is off. Thank you for that, Stacy. It's a it's a hard story to read, but you tell it very well. There was no surprise there. And it feels like an important, really sort of extraordinarily important story to tell, since we're talking about real human lives that are destroyed here. But let's put some depth onto this, some nuance onto this story. So how exactly do these housing projects you mentioned go from this period where they're sort of seen as sanctuaries to this period where they become truly sort of scary places?
Yeah. When I was first looking into it, I mean, it happened in so again just over a few years, and
Yeah.
it just shocked me. And I came across this one quote that described it exactly. I.D. Robbins, who was a builder and a reformist, who worked with one of the community groups I talk about in the book, the East Brooklyn Congregation. But he said, put a few criminals in a large building and you have a crime wave. And as soon as he said that, a light went off. And so I talked to some of the people that had lived in these buildings at the time as they started to turn. And they went, yes, yes, exactly. So, like a drug dealer would move into the building and just immediately start harassing the neighbors and terrifying them. So
Mhm.
people started moving out quickly, and more bad guys and drug dealers moved in, and within months, really, but at least over up to a year, they owned the building.
Yeah. I live in Bedford-Stuyvesant and have lived here for a very long time. When I moved in, the neighborhood was blocks of every block had boarded up buildings and lots of it was the tail end of a long dark period, and the locals that had been here for a while would tell similar stories about Bed-Stuy in those days. You talked about some of the problems with the 75th precinct. Um, uh, can you put some dimension on that? Obviously they're not all bad, or are they all bad? And why weren't they doing more to address the rising crime?
It was bad in the 7-5, and whenever East New Yorkers come to any of my talks and I talk about Michael Dow, one of the first things they say is there were a lot of Michael Downs. But that said, I don't want to make the NYPD out as the bad guys here, although they did contribute. But what happened in East New York was the result and the aftermath of financial crimes. The NYPD does not investigate these kind of crimes, and they're not responsible for what was happening or stopping
Yeah.
that. And as far as the rise in street crime, which they are responsible for, this had never happened before. This kind of crime wave that takes over like it did and so quickly just had never happened before. So they were not prepared, and no one was. There was no procedures in place like, okay, how do you take a building back? Um, Interestingly, some of the best responses to that did not come from the police, but from local activists in these community groups I talked about, like the East Brooklyn congregations.
Hmm.
This was a group of church leaders who met in 1978. They saw that their neighborhoods were being destroyed, and so they met. Well, what? Nobody's doing anything about it. What can we do about it? And I write about some of the things that they do. But one of the first things they did was they got the city to tear down the abandoned buildings because they were just perpetual crime scenes.
Hmm.
So they were successful, and a lot of buildings got torn down, but that led to even more abandoned land. And nobody was doing building in East New York at the time. Nobody wanted to build in East New York.
Oh.
So they never thought of themselves as developers, but they thought, if we don't build, who will? So they came up with something that became known as the Nehemiah Plan, and I won't go into a lot of detail, but it was basically affordable housing.
Yeah.
This long line of modest apartments, all connected, modest but sound
Hmm. Hmm.
and this. So they thought single family homes, even lots and lots of single family homes, were the
Yeah.
answer to these projects. And there was another great, just a small thing I came across. This group, the East New York Urban Youth Corps, and their mission was also to focus on youth in East New York and residential housing. But one of the things they did was on a particularly bad block that had been taken over by drug dealers, they got the Department of Parks and Recreation to declare it a play street. So from I forget the timing, from early in the morning to 4 o'clock, the streets were closed, and children took them over, and they had like stuff that they could play with, and that eventually got the drug dealers to leave that block.
Yeah. Um, and just, I mean, on you had said earlier about in your intro about you put the sort of the statistics in perspective about the number of unsolved cases and such. Um, that's not even particularly unique to either the city or this time period. Like, right? I mean, like my understanding, there was a part of my research once that took me in that realm. Like police are typically sort of either under-resourced, or we think from Hollywood and TV shows that all the sort of money's going into like solving cold cases or hard cases and things like that. And the reality is they have to it ends up going into a lot of other things, not actually felonies and those sorts of things. I don't know if you want to sort of speak to that, but am I right on that? Like,
Yes. I learned the same thing when I wrote about the police
yeah,
department's cold case squad, and I was shocked to learn
yeah,
how easy it is to get away with murder. Like, yes, there's problems with the police department. Like, I learned that. I hope I'm getting these stats right. It's been a long time since I've written this book, but in New York, if you were a person of color, you were twice as likely to be murdered, and your case was 4 times as likely to go cold.
yeah,
But essentially, the way it works is to get, I don't even know if I should go into this, but you can get away with murder so easily that, and it basically shoot them so you don't get close to them and you're not leaving any kind of biological or trace evidence. Do it at night so there's fewer witnesses, and the ones that are out are not as considered as good witnesses as office workers during the day. And most of all, keep your mouth shut.
yeah. Well, what I remember is that a shocking amount of both police and judicial casework goes into like traffic crimes versus the stuff that we imagine or that media and other figures sort of think is the balance of budgetary focus and day-to-day focus. Um,
I'll never forget this commanding officer telling me, if you're murdered in Manhattan, that case gets solved.
sure.
Outside Manhattan, no.
Well, yeah. This will take us too far off of subject, but you're maybe familiar with the Schoolcraft case that was right around the time that I moved into Bed-Stuy, and that folks who catch that reference will I advise you all to listen to the This American Life episode on that story. It's something out of a movie. Um, a bad movie. So after the Eastern Service Corporation is prosecuted, what happens next? You said everyone was doing it. Who else was prosecuted? How many trials were there?
Um, Tony Seta, who headed up the Eastern Service case, left the Eastern District when that case was over. But when he left, there were still like a bunch of cases teed up to go to prosecution. And aside from they started with four, and all of those were prosecuted. After that, there were no more prosecutions. And since a lot of the people again that I would like to have interviewed about that, unfortunately, were no longer alive. I don't really have the definitive answer, but everyone who was still alive who could give me an answer, but weren't the ones who made these decisions, said there just was no will within the federal court system to proceed with these cases.
Yeah.
Um,
And
it's
why do
I've been writing about criminal justice, going back to Damnation Island, and
yeah.
it's always been like this. I
Yeah.
mean, there, like just very briefly on Roosevelt Island, we had
Yeah.
two prisons for minor crimes and for felonies. And in the 19th century, this one warden in the annual report just asked straight out, like, we know wealthy people commit crimes, um, and yet you never send them to me. There's like no one is in our prisons. So
So
what's
what
going
about Jeffrey Epstein?
Well, the whole point of this book, I want to show that
Yeah.
white financial crimes are as devastating
Yeah, yeah.
as street crimes, yet they're walking around free.
Yeah. Um, so why do you think they aren't tracking white collar crimes to the same extent? Um, it's you're alluding to it, but you want to answer that
Well,
question head on?
I don't think it's accidental that. I mean, this is probably a longer conversation. Um, I I don't think it's an accident that we're not tracking white collar crimes. It's in the best interest of wealthy people and people with political power that this not be known. We have endless articles about street crime and how dangerous it is, and almost nothing about the dangers of financial crime. There's a few TV shows now, um, but like what happened with the subprime mortgage scandal in the 1960s, in a relatively short amount of time, um, white collar criminals and politicians and those who support them managed to change the narrative from what was going on, from a civil rights issue to a street crime issue. And the subprime mortgage scandal, which devastated neighborhoods of color across the United States, was very quickly forgotten. And it just kills me because I think of these financial criminals then and now. They get to sit back and laugh as people fight each other about who is to blame for what happened, all the way up to today, where many still think that black citizens were responsible for their own destruction then and now, and few are aware of the crimes leading to the subprime mortgage scandal then and now. I don't
Yeah.
know if that came out at all
No, in
clear.
the book, yeah, or yeah, no, um, I think that's well put. So this is maybe sort of a redundant question, but why weren't more laws put in place then you think to curb financial crime?
Well, again, it's the wealthy have been tinkering with our criminal justice system for as far back as I have researched. And they've made it difficult to gather evidence and to prosecute financial crimes. And in many cases, they've made it almost impossible to even call what they're doing crimes. It's okay to say it's unethical, but it's not crimes. So so I was researching at the time what laws and what was being done, what was put into place, and I could find lots addressing street crime, which is okay. Street crime was a problem that needed to be addressed, but absolutely none. I mean, none addressing the financial crimes that were going on at the same time and rising at the same time and causing terrible things to happen at the same time. And I've tracked them since then. And what I found was the few that were put into place before and a couple that were put into place much later, now they're like basically neutering them and taking the teeth out of what little is in place and making it even easier for white collar criminals to get away with crimes. It, it's to the point where all a white collar criminal has to do to get away with a crime is just go ahead and commit it, because no one is investigating them, no one's coming after them, no one's going to arrest them, no one's going to prosecute them.
Yeah. Um, how much is that about resources too, right?
Seriously?
Um,
There's plenty of money for investigating, other crimes.
yeah. Well, I
And
mean,
if you took,
but there's a, you're going up against, you'll get, um, it's why most people sort of settle out of court, right? If you're going up against folks that have a very deep pocketbook.
yeah, yeah. And
Um,
then there's tons of money that have gone into like the budgets of police departments. But again, that was another thing I looked into, and what I saw was money being taken away from those investigating white collar crimes.
yeah.
And now they're
Um,
being told just don't investigate them, focus on street crime.
yeah. I mean, my last question, just stepping back, and we'll take questions from the audience in a minute. Please send in those questions as now. You know, everyone is naturally afraid of street crime. I moved into this neighborhood. I thought about it myself. Um, I think one of the bitter ironies about it is uh, the crime often. This is not my area of research, but I'll put this in the form of a question. This is my impression from what I've read about the research. Uh, the crime is highly localized. For example, like the literature that has come out about white flight. I mean, it was not as if these folks were actually in those neighborhoods in most cases, right? Exposed to that on the street. It was other factors that sort of drove that flight. Um, I'm thinking specifically of the Leah Boston's book for those who are listening and paying attention to the references. But why don't people care more about white collar crime? Why does street crime get all the attention and white collar crime seems to bore?
Well, if you're living in a high crime neighborhood, I can understand the concern. But most of the United
I mean, we
States,
know, yeah. I mean, which I mean, and all the people who were in East New York and in your story, and there've been excellent books in the last few years.
yeah,
James Foreman's books, Bessla Weaver's book, Michael Jared Fortner's book. I mean, people in these neighborhoods were the most concerned about street crime, right? But
yeah,
they had a more nuanced picture of it than was often presented in the press. But I'm
yes.
cutting you off. Sorry.
No, 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 it's true. So they they are frightened because it's right there in front of them. But most of the United States do not live in high crime neighborhoods. And it's my opinion that we're here and we've been here for a while because we have this long history of criminalizing the poor and absolving the rich. Like in the 19th century, it was all about immigrants and the wealthy robber barons who were causing much more destruction than the immigrants. Nobody's afraid of them. And it's like we've been groomed. We have endless books, movies, TV shows, articles about street crime and the police. And they're continuously amplifying people's fears about crimes, but only street crimes. And so it's completely ingrained in our national psyche. And this is why people accept ridiculous stories about immigrants eating dogs, and they'll accept stats about crime going up when it's actually going down. So as a result, people don't fear bankers and the wealthy. They may not like them, but they're not afraid of them. And really, while the destruction they cause is slow and pernicious and largely invisible to most people, um, their crimes are much more wide ranging and devastating and at times as deadly.
Yeah, well, speaking of subprime, I mean, how many millions of people lost their homes, right? Which and are now captive to private equity firms.
I don't know if
Yeah.
I have the time to tell my big short story. Do I have time?
Sure, yeah.
Well, So I was researching how they discovered these crimes because, and that's a whole other story. White collar crimes are much harder to investigate than murder, which has very obvious evidence. So it was discovered in the course of a routine blockbusting investigation, and they found these homeowners that had gotten FHA mortgages uh, when they had no income, and they knew there were all these programs to help lower income people buy homes, but they still had to fill out applications and prove that they could afford to make the mortgage payments. So they found all these people with zero income that were able to buy homes. So they're like, oh, it was like the first hint that there was a crime. So I read these. So the Senate later investigated all of this, and there's like 900 pages of testimony. And I went through this testimony, and I found the testimony of one of those investigators who talked to the criminals that explain. So they got together the people who sold these buildings and asked them, so why, how did this happen? And they just openly confessed to the crimes that they had committed. And in the Senate testimony, he's talking, he's going, he was like so shocked that the guy just talked about these terrible things he was doing like it was nothing. And he said, I looked at the guy and I said, what have you done? Do you realize these are poor people? Do you realize most of them have now lost their home? You were supposed to help them with these programs. How could you do this? And when I was researching this, I read The Big Short, and I was looking into the 2008 scandal. And I watched the movie The Big Short, and there was this scene that just recreated exactly that Senate testimony where Steve Carell, plays the guy investigating, and he talks to these financial guys, and it's the same thing. They just openly admit what they're doing. And so he goes, excuse me a second, and he goes off with his colleagues, and he goes, why are they confessing? And the guy answers, they're not confessing, they're bragging. And then, just like my guy from the 70s, he goes back and he goes, do people understand what they're buying? And he answers, I just tell them, I focus on the immigrants, and I tell them they're going to get a home and they'll sign wherever I tell them to sign. And that was exactly what happened in the 60s and 70s. They targeted immigrants and people, low income families who never thought that the American dream was going to be theirs. And so when they said, I'm going to get you a home, they too just signed wherever they told them to sign.
I mean, on the sense of guiltlessness, I always think about David Simon did this interview once where he talked about, the famous author of The Wire, the TV series and other books and
Great
such,
writer.
who was a journalist at the Baltimore Sun for decades, and in that time interviewed corrupt union officials, corrupt politicians, mobsters, street criminals, white financial criminals, all sorts of people. And he said, the thing is, every single one of them thought they were a good guy.
Yeah,
They're
no
convinced of it,
remorse. No
you
remorse.
know? But that's the thing that, they all do. They all do. Um, Okay, so we've got a stack of questions here. I'm going to remind everyone again, this is your moment. You've got Stacy here. Don't let her go to waste. First question, folks want to see you again. They want to know if you're going to be doing any book signings in New York live in person. They want to meet you and get a signed copy.
Thank you. The only one
Where does
that's in person, if you go to my website, stacyhorn.com, there's one on Saturday, which is it's going to be very interesting. It's this guy Tom D, who's a comedian, and but he
I know
also
Tom.
is. You do?
I know
So
Tom.
I'm like, oh, I
Yeah.
hope I do well because
This is
I'm
a good
not fun.
event. I'm happy to plug Tom's event. You should go to Tom's event.
Well, he's a big history buff, so
Is
that's an
very
in-person
popular on
event.
the YouTubes. Yep. Okay. Tom D is New York. Hello, Tom, if you're watching. So Myron Glucksman says, what's the neighborhood like now?
Yeah, it's much better. At its height, they were having around 190 murders a year, and now it's usually around five. But
Yeah.
when I talk to people who live there, they want me to know that it's not, this terrible place anymore, but they also say, they're still careful about where they walk. And that was something I heard again and again when I interviewed people who grew up there. They said they always planned how they were going to get somewhere very carefully. Even police planned how they were going to move through East New York. But I, for instance, have been there a bunch of times, walking around all the places that I write about and taking pictures. And yes, it was during the day, but I never felt uncomfortable. I never felt in
No,
danger.
there's nothing wrong with East New York. I have been to East New York many times, and
Yeah.
it is a fine neighborhood, and we should not be stigmatizing this neighborhood anymore. Um, there was a question from Jean L about where exactly um, uh, where exactly this neighborhood is. I would just rather than sort of sharing screen here.
Oh, I meant to put a map up.
It's fine. Southern Brooklyn, sort of near the Queens border, on Jamaica Bay, and it's surrounded by Howard Beach, Canarsie, Brownsville, and Woodhaven. So anyone may be familiar with the Jackie Robinson, it's about the border of the neighborhood starts about 10 minutes south from there and then goes all the way to the water. Um, Another basic sort of fact question: what year exactly was this scandal, the FHA scandal that profiled in your book?
Well, it started in 1968 and it was prosecuted in 72 to 73. And even though it was prosecuted, the crimes continued to be committed for decades, really. I would Google and search and find newspaper articles around the country. So they were prosecuting in places other than New York, like Detroit. There were a bunch of cases, Philadelphia, New Jersey, California. Yeah, I don't know if I answered the question.
No, that's I think that's answering it enough. And if it's not, then please write back and let us know. Um, we have another person asking if you can maybe walk through one of the cases a little more slowly and connect the dots between the fraudulent appraisal and the loss of a building. Maybe even uh, d d devolving a little more about the story, the woman that's you met shown on screen there a minute ago. I'm blanking on her name right now.
Well, so a bunch of brokers um, were lured into these crimes by the Eastern Service Corporation,
No.
who, by the way, was in the same building as the FHA.
Mm.
So they would go to one floor with, a bottle of scotch and make friends with the appraisers and underwriters. So the brokers were in on it. The mortgage banks were in on it. The FHA was in on it. And the credit reporting agencies who go through these applications and say everything's fine and good, everything's sound here. But even though they were indicted and put on trial, they were unable to prove that the credit reporting agencies were in on it. And they also thought the conventional banks were in on it. Anthony Aceto, who prosecuted the Eastern Service Corporation, thought Chase Bank was guilty of the same crimes, but he could not prove it. So I'm not sure where I lost you, but so they would sell a building that had a lot of serious problems that were not repaired. So people would move in, and shortly after they moved in, it was just a cascade of things going wrong, which they could not afford to fix. The building would be abandoned, and when a building, so it would be foreclosed, abandoned, and the FHA at the time insisted that all buildings that before they would pay out the mortgage had to be emptied of all tenants. So if somebody had a building and they had tenants that were paying rent to help pay their mortgage payments, they'd be out on the street even if they were paying their rent each month. And so what the FHA would do was they would just slap some tin up on the windows and just move on, and the buildings would be abandoned. And shortly afterwards, kids would break into the building and party and vandalize, leave the water running so floors would collapse. And after them, the next wave would be criminals, drug dealers, murderers, rapists, would use these buildings for their purposes. Fires. Oh, there was another thing I talk about. There was like this period of fires, and it was happening also in the Bronx at the time, but in East New York.
Sure.
And the city at the time, this is just another example of, instead of coming in like the cavalry, they retreated. They hired the RAND Institute to study the FDNY to see how they could do their jobs better, and make any suggestions, and also how they could cut the budget. And one of the things that they suggested was closing down engine and ladder companies. And in some presentations I show, like East New York, had like the busiest engines and ladders in New York, and I show how like the third busy. So they say fix the problem by getting rid of engine companies. They didn't do it in neighborhoods that didn't have fires. They did it in the neighborhoods that had the most. So like the third busiest engine and the sixth busiest ladder got closed down in East New York.
There's a book that we'll be featuring in our series, in our book series later this semester, by Bench Ansfield. It's just came out, called Born in Flames: The Business of Arson and the Remaking of the American City, which goes into uh, uh, this story in further depth. And I'd be remiss to note also Keeanga Yamada Taylor's book of 2020, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer, called Race for Profit: How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Homeownership. Both of those books will go into further detail about this story.
I
So
have to say, Race for Profit, I couldn't have written my book without that book.
yeah, it's an excellent book. Um, Yeah, so this is, I mean, and reading, again, kind of it's amazing to me how often kind of New York gets sort of singled out. It's the fiscal crisis too, right? I mean, as if it's like only New York. And that was the whole kind of story. It was sort of politicized and turned to this thing about, something specific about New York and what New York, the mistakes that New York was making, right? Good intentions gone awry, or reckless spending or something. It was sort of like created the miserable conditions of the 1970s. But these are conditions that we're seeing across the country. They're caught up with things like deindustrialization, suburbanization. They have many roots and causes, and the subprime mortgage story is just kind of one dimension of it. Um, uh, so, was there a particular reason why that woman was targeted? Aaron Claremont wants to know. The woman that you had shown earlier in that in the photo that was murdered.
Yeah, see, it's like one of the reasons I chose her. She was murdered because of her involvement in drugs, and I wanted to show how the victims are blamed, and so some people would like, oh well, she made bad choices, and so not that she deserved to die, but like that she was part of the problem. And I wanted to show, like, I don't know how to explain this. I grew up in the 60s. And at the time, when I was a teenager, we were all doing drugs. We were all trying everything. And my friends, who were also teenagers, were the ones selling it to me. And so I know myself, I know my friends. We were not these big evil drug dealers that are causing all the problems in the United States. We were just kids. And this
Only
victim,
period in American history where we were spending more on drug treatment than drug prosecution, and that was because a huge part of the heroin epidemic was GIs returning
yeah,
from
exactly,
Vietnam.
exactly. So people
Guys
make
like every other soldier.
so the drug problem. So she was carrying drugs for someone, and she was arrested, and she was murdered by the drug dealers that she was carrying drugs for. And I talked to a nun, Sister Margaret, who worked at, I don't know, worked as a, she was at St. John Cantius Church, and she
Hmm.
was saying, all the girls at the time were doing it. And she said they were
Yeah,
good girls. This was just
sure.
kids making poor decisions. So I wanted to humanize these victims that are held responsible for the problem when they had nothing to do with the problem. And meanwhile, the people who did cause the problem, little happens to them. Like the
Well, we
people
know
that
from
did, that
research on
people that,
addiction.
go ahead,
Yes.
sorry.
Well, we know from research on addiction that it's people use it as a way to medicate for trauma. Right. So, um, uh, circling back to the story about like why isn't this better known and why isn't the larger kind of phenomenon white collar crime sort of more prosecuted? An anonymous attendee writes, one of my colleagues at work was on an FHA grand jury. He asked me to explain the case as neither he nor his fellow jurors understood the complexity. Could that be a reason why so many white collar criminals get away with their crimes? And I think that's has to be part of it, right? I mean, the Big Short opens with this whole thing where it's like a primer on like what the hell, like you have to kind of break it down in a way where it's street crime seems a little bit more accessible with a, or is that wrong?
No, I think actually, I think it can be explained simply, and
Mm,
it's in the criminal's best interest to make you think that it's very complicated when it isn't.
mm, yeah. Okay. Say more.
Well, I was able to, I think, describe it easily, and I don't think, like, there was one element, sorry, I've got my cat here,
No.
of the Big Short that made it more complex, and that was that they bundled all these mortgages into packages,
Yeah.
mortgage-backed
This,
securities, and
yeah, yeah.
yeah, so
False
it
swaps.
enabled them to make a lot more money. But I could explain that in just a few words. It
Sure.
doesn't have to be complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a fair point. Um, Lots of economic questions actually. Alam Bookbard Klein writes, how do you situate the East New York rezoning effort in the de Blasio era within this history? Do you think it has been effective thus far at remedying some of the historic harms around housing injustice?
I am not
That's
an
outside
expert
the
about
scope of
East New
your,
York now,
yeah, yeah,
but I did look into that because I wanted to, in the epilogue, talk about what was happening now in with housing in East New York. And what I found was proposals and projects that are introduced, and then nothing really becomes of it. Nothing much becomes of it. Small scale things are happening. Like there's an area of East New York called the Hole because it's below sea level. Is that the way to put it? But it's below the lay of the land, and so whenever it rains, it becomes like it's flooded, and it doesn't have a sewer system, so it becomes flooded with sewage as well. And every 10 years or so, there's something comes up where they're going to fix it, and they never do because it's not an easy problem to solve, and it is going to be an expensive problem to solve. But I did just read about an effort that was just introduced recently that sounded better to me, but of course I don't remember the details. It does involve people selling their homes to the city and leaving, but the proposal for like the stages that they were going to take to fix it sounded more convincing to me that it might actually happen. It would
mm,
be interesting to see if Mondani has any
mm.
puts his steps into this at all.
Yeah. Well, on that, maybe a natural segue here to another question from Milana Giratano. Were any of the immigrant victims awarded restitution or restored their homes?
No,
Yeah.
no. There were some lawsuits where people sued HUD for what had happened, but for the ones that I researched, pretty much all of them did not get anything. They lost that. And it wasn't that there were politicians that saw this and said, we have to do something. We have to make, we have to restore what happened to these people. But no, no. That's because this is another thing I think that white collar criminals take advantage of. It's a lot easier to commit crimes when the victims are poor and people of color because fewer people care. And the people who are poor don't have, the money to really mount a fight.
No. Um, we have another question here about source material from Jill Homburg. To what extent did you use Walter Tabbitt's book, How East New York Became a Ghetto?
A lot,
A lot.
a lot. Um, I had a couple of books on my desk. Race for Profit, Thabit's book, How East New York Became a Ghetto. And there was another journalist, Brian Boyer. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, but he wrote Cities Destroyed for Cash about the same crimes that were happening in Detroit. And that's a great book. Like, if you're interested in the history of that crime, I would read that book as well. I got some great quotes from his book. He basically said, what was happening in the United States at the time. White collar criminals were murdering the cities.
What about journalists and press? I mean, we've made you've made a bunch of references to it, but I don't know if we've talked about it with focus. Did this just get this just didn't it got framed differently, or it didn't get it didn't get attention at all?
No,
How
it
did
got a
how,
lot of attention,
yeah,
surprisingly.
yeah,
Um, but I think it's like now. The victims in the story were not victims that most people cared about.
yeah,
It wasn't happening to them. It was at the time, and it was similar in 2008. The
yeah,
criminals at the time were focusing on black neighborhoods, black and Hispanic neighborhoods. So people cared less about what was happening to people in black and Hispanic neighborhoods. I don't know what to say. I'm sure nobody who's at this lecture, falls into that category, but
yeah,
and people, oh god, it was also another world. Like, people were not as aware then as we are now about the extent of racism in this country. So,
white people, yeah.
yeah.
Um, well, I saved the last question from Leslie Ehrlich, who writes, "What parallels and differences would you draw between that and the the crisis of the '90s and the crisis of '08?" I mean, you've talked a lot about parallels and differences, but is there any more that you want to add about um, since subprime mortgage is the at least the case the study of white collar crime that you're profiling in this book? Are there other major differences or similarities that you would want to leave
The only
people
thing
with
I would
before we
say
close?
is there's nothing to stop it from happening again. Um, I I interviewed. It's at the end of my book. I got Jack Blum, who was the lawyer for the Senate committee investigating these crimes in the 1970s, together with Anthony Acetta, to just talk about that. Like, you did all this work, and here we are, And they said that it was so funny because they were young men at the time, and they said, we thought we'd fixed the problem, we thought we'd solved it, we did it, and we made the world a better place. And they got to watch in horror
Yeah,
as, over the years it keeps happening again and again. I mean, to a greater or lesser degree. The
yeah,
2008 version was spectacular, but it's
yeah,
not the only time this happened.
yeah, yeah. Well, there's a good Mark Twain quote about that. Um,
Yeah.
well, Stacy, it's a heartbreaking, depressing book, but you, I think, do um, some measure of justice to the tragedy or crime that you're talking about. So thank you for that. Thank you for
Thank
coming
you.
in and sharing your research with us. The website again is stacyhorn.com. So if you want to learn more about Stacy, upcoming events and other research, you can find her there. Uh, Great to see you again, Stacy. Always good.
Thank you so
Um,
much for inviting me.
you're very welcome. And thank you all for joining us. We'll be having another event in a couple of weeks and posting the rest of our calendar soon. Thanks for joining and good night.